So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we have Egor Dontsov joining us, and we'll give the meat of the presentation. But I will start with an introduction, and that will allow a few more folks to filter in, and then we'll turn the tables over to Egor. So my fun observation or fact for the day is that due to coin flips, George Washington is still making presidential decisions, even from the grave. So think about that every time you flip a coin. So at the very high level, for those who are new to ResFrac, ResFrac is a fully coupled hydraulic fracture, reservoir, wellbore, and geomechanics simulator. So why do we care that it does that? The mission of the company is to maximize economic returns for our users and clients. And the way that we're able to do so in unconventional is to look at our independent variables that we can control, things like cluster and stage spacing, landing zone, parent-child interactions, or refracking a well. And ResFrac allows you to do all of that in a single software solution, which starts with fracturing, progresses through leak-off, closure, production, and then any subsequent activities like a child frac or refrac in that same pad. So I like to think of this as three regimes that are really all integrated into one coupled solution. And so we have hydraulic fracture propagation and proppant distribution that then progresses into production. The middle panel here, which would typically be a reservoir simulator. And then as you produce, that has impacts on the stress tensor, direction, and magnitude in the matrix. And so that's also fully integrated into the code. So it's all being solved together. So in every single time step, mass, energy, material balance is all being solved, which allows us to simulate complex interactions like this parent-child simulation that I set up as a demo. So here we'll see two parent wells fracked sequentially, and then three infill wells 5 years later will be fracked and in a dual or simul frac manner where all three are simultaneous. So here we'll see that initial frac growing. I'm showing proppant distribution in the lower left. And then the second well, now we'll see production in the fractures and matrix as that pressure draws down. And then here's the child wells coming in and fracking in between. And all of now the long-term production. And so you can see things like frac hits being captured, as well as the interaction and fluid flow going from one element to the next. And finally, the bottom right here is showing the pore elastic stress change. So in the areas where we've seen depletion, we're also going to see changes in that minimum stress and maximum stress as well, actually. So over the last 3 years, we have gained experience across the Americas, pretty much every major basin. We use that to help provide context for questions today. As a company, we engage with clients in three predominant manners. We license the software directly to clients, we provide consulting services, and then we also do joint industry studies. Today is really meant to be technical, so if you have questions about commercial relationships or how we structure those, feel free to just reach out to me afterwards, Garrett@resfrac.com, and happy to do those discussions. So that third engagement mode, as I described, are industry studies. We're launching our next in February, which will investigate parent-child interactions with the objective of delivering prescriptive, actionable recommendations on how to complete child wells, drawing upon a vast wealth of data sets that are being contributed from operators, and really make breakthroughs on the characterization and understanding of the physical processes behind frac hits and how those impact the production and performance of wells subsequently. So with that, I promise to reserve the bulk of the time for Egor, who's our star of the day, and I will be turning over the screen to him.
All right, thanks, Garrett. Let me turn my video. Right, so in the area of digital world, right, we don't see each other in person, but at least we have technology which helps us to see each other at least over the internet. So hello everyone, and thanks Garrett for the introduction. So today I'm going to talk about quite an interesting topic, at least from my point of view, is about the geometry of hydraulic fracture. How can it be complicated even in simple cases? Okay, and this is actually one I'm going to mostly focus on my previous experience and previous work, but it all has been published, right? It's available. And yeah, so basically the earlier one, I'm going to go through a little bit of math and fundamentals, and then go through the main topic, which is applications. And then towards the end, I'm going to give you an outlook of what is coming next in ResFrac. It's actually very, very exciting. So I'm looking forward to the last part. Let's see. All right, so let me start by talking about this fracture modeling coin, right? I mean, I guess you saw on Garrett's title slide, the joke about the coin, right? So I decided, well, to continue on this. So here's our hydraulic fracturing coin right in the middle, the gray one. And not everybody is aware, but there are two different groups of people working on similar problems. So there's a group of people working on hydraulic fracture modeling from theoretical point of view, okay, so mostly people from academia. And then there are people working from practical point of view, right? So even though both are doing hydraulic fracturing, but they have very, very different goals, right? So if you are on the practical side, your number one goal is to solve practical problems, right? I mean, so your operators come and have practical problems to solve. So that's what we want to achieve. From theoretical point of view, on the other hand, the goal is to develop the state-of-the-art numerical algorithms and maybe some do mathematical analysis of the problem, right? And the goal is to create new knowledge, right? And again, the goals are very, very different, right? And so the approaches are very, very different. And unfortunately, what I've seen so far, that people from two different groups don't interact that often, okay? And I was lucky enough to actually be on both sides of this coin, and so I can actually, try to, as I outline here, the bottom, try to transfer some knowledge from one part to another, and vice versa. But today, I presume most of the listeners are on the practical side, and so I'm going to bring more kind of knowledge from theoretical side to you. All right. So as I said, again, the beginning is going to be a little bit more theory, and then we're going to go more towards practice. So first, I want to introduce you to the concept of tip region of a hydraulic fracture and why is it important, right? First of all, say if you have this radial fracture on the left, and then you zoom into the tip region, right? Then the model for this tip, right, is equivalent to semi-infinite fracture geometry, right? So we have this kind of opening, and then we have a constant velocity of propagation of the fracture tip, and so that's what we analyzed. And this is a very fundamental problem, and its advantage, it has analytical solutions, okay? Because if you consider the most general problem right away, then there's no way you can do it anything analytically, you have to do it numerically. But here you can do it analytically, so you can get some more understanding and to see how various parameters affect fracture geometry, essentially do sensitivity study. Okay, why and how this solution is used, right? So this solution can be used as near tip logic in hydraulic fraction simulators to track the fracture front, right? And this, I'm citing here the pioneering work by Pearson and Tournay in 2008. So if you want to track the fracture front continuously, right, not just opening one element at a time, but continuously through space, then you need to use something like this asymptotic solution. Okay. Another thing, or another reason why this is important, is it can be used as a key element to construct quick solutions, right? So, but often we simplify geometry. Here I have references for my previous works. Here's a reference for approximate or fast solution for radial geometry, and then the second one for elliptical geometry. And by the way, I'm going to have all the list of references at the end, so you will always be able to go back and check them if you want. Okay. So I'm going to skip most of the math. I'm just going to tell you the results. So for the near the tip, the way the fracture behaves is the following. So right near the fracture tip, it's the rock which determines the behavior, and so the fracture width is controlled by fracture toughness essentially, and so the width is proportional to square root of distance from the tip. And later on, if you have leak off, then we have a different behavior. And then later on, again, if you have large viscosity, we have a different behavior for the fracture width. So here the width is proportional or related to not just the distance from the tip but things like tip velocity. So that the faster you go, the wider the frac is. And so here mu is the viscosity, C is leak off coefficient, E is the Young's modulus, like plane strain Young's modulus are shown here, and betas are just some numbers. And these are very old solutions in a sense. You see, I mean, the reference 1995. So they've been known for a while. But the question is how to use them, right? So that's, and I'm going to cover this later on. And then the question is, say you know this analytic solution, but which one should you use, and where do they apply? Okay, and then comes another paper where we can actually draw the map where all these three solutions apply. So basically, there are two dimensionless numbers which depend on problem parameters. Again, think about this: your Young's modulus, toughness, viscosity, tip velocity. So you calculate these two, and so you have a point in this two-dimensional space. And so these regions, red, blue, and green, tell you where you are and which one applies. And so this is a very first introduction of these fracture regimes, right? So the fracture regimes basically it tells us where or for what problem parameters certain physics dominates the response. Okay, so if our problem parameters combine such that we are here in the K regime, it means the fracture response is determined solely by fracture toughness. And so that essentially the solution is not sensitive to viscosity. So you can vary viscosity, a little bit plus minus, and then the solution is going to be the same. On the other hand, if your numbers come up and you are here in M regime or viscosity dominated regime, then the solution is insensitive to fracture toughness. Means you're going to be changing fracture toughness, but your solution is going to be the same, right? So that's that's what I mean by the regime and domination of one physical process over another, right? So here viscosity dominates, here toughness dominates, and here leak off dominates. Okay. But again, I want you think about it as the ultimate sensitivity study, but you do it in terms of these weird dimensionless parameters. And the advantage of doing the dimensionless parameters, by the way, is that if you count the number of parameters even for these problems, you have leak off coefficient, viscosity, Young's modulus, toughness, velocity, at least 5. And here only 2, right? So it's much easier. I mean, if you go from 5-dimensional parametric space to 2-dimensional, it's much easier to analyze. And this is not just fancy math, right? It has been observed experimentally. So here I'm showing you results from lab work by Banger. And here, so this kind of jagged line shows the experimental results of fracture widths near the fracture tip, okay, as a function of distance from the tip. And so the dashed lines are the two limiting solutions. One is for toughness domination and another one for the viscosity dominated regime. And so here on the left, we have a viscosity dominated solution. And you see this jagged line eventually follows this viscosity dominated solution. And on the right is toughness dominated solution. We see they have square root behavior near the fracture tip, and we do follow it. Okay, well, the viscosity dominated asymptotics, it's at the bottom. So again, it's not just in a fancy math, and it has been validated experimentally. So it is true, right? And within the assumption of the model. But again, where I'm all going is how do we use it, right? And again, I just want you to remember just a few things. Again, it's a very brief introduction, but to this particular topic. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, or Garrett, he's gonna forward you a request to me. But what I want you to remember that if you focus on the near tip, there are 3 analytic solutions that we know, okay? And I want you to grasp the concept of this regime so that there are situations when certain parameters, or certain physics dominates the fracture response, okay? And there are situations when some other part of physics, like viscosity, dominates the response. And so we need to understand for what parameters we have domination of one physical process over another, okay? And then, again, I'm gonna meet all the mass. And again, if you have any questions, you have I have cited the paper here, all the mass is there, and you can send me an email. I'll be happy to chat with you about the mass. I really like it. But you can do something similar, okay, for a radial fracture. And again, it all goes towards the notion of fracture regimes, right? So what physics is important. And so there are actually 4 limiting cases. So if you just inject fluid at a constant rate into homogeneous formations, you have this penny-shaped radial fracture. Now you may have 4 distinct limits. One is storage viscosity, when essentially the viscosity dominates the dissipation process and it determines actually the fracture geometry. And storage essentially means that there is almost no leak-off, or leak-off is negligible. So whatever you pump stays within the fracture. And then you have storage toughness, is when, again, you have no leak-off, but you have effectively no viscosity. Basically, the fracture geometry is determined purely by fracture toughness or rock properties. And then there are the 2 regimes associated with high leak-off or large leak-off. Again, you have diminution either toughness or viscosity, but now you have very porous formation and most of your fluid leaks into formation. So these are the 4 limiting cases. And this actually been analyzed a lot by Detourné co-workers. This is 2016, the review paper, but there are many, many other papers in the early 2000s you may look at. But the result is that, again, you can summarize them on this parametric diagram, okay? There are 2 dimensionless numbers. So, I mean, essentially, let me ask you this, right? So let's think about this way. Now you have viscosity, say, I don't know, 500 centipoise. Is it viscosity dominated or toughness dominated? Well, it depends. It depends on the Young's modulus, injection rate, toughness, and so on. So there are a combination of parameters. And here's, again, 2 dimensionless parameters. I mean, I didn't list them there. They look fairly long, but you can compute them. And so you compute those, and it gives you a point in this parametric space. Now, if you land right here where M is, you go and say, okay, it's storage viscosity. It means that there is no sensitivity of the solution to toughness. Okay, it means viscosity determines how far fracture goes, how wide fracture is. But again, the solution is sensitive to viscosity on the other hand, right? And then K is the opposite, right? So that's when you have sensitivity to toughness, but no sensitivity to viscosity. And then if you're in the middle, then you have sensitivity to both. And actually for field values, typically what I've seen, we are roughly in the middle. So that's why we have sensitivity to both, okay? And the same applies to your leak-off, right? I mean, say if I tell you permeability of rock is, I don't know, 1000 nanodarcy. Is it high, is it low? Well, again, it depends what you pump, how you pump. But again, if you come up with these dimensionless numbers, you can tell right away whether it's really high permeability, so you're gonna lose all the fluid almost instantly through the fracture walls, or it's all gonna stay. So that's the purpose of this map. And yeah, so let me, again, just things to remember. So what I wanted you to realize is that, again, this notion of these limiting cases. And so essentially, because I'm going to be now using this parametric space for practical, or relatively speaking, practical cases, and just want to see what the difference in fracture geometries we have depending on this place in parametric space. But I wanted to think about that if we are here, it means that we engage the viscosity, right, in more over toughness. If we are here in the K regime, it means we engage more toughness, or the solution is determined by toughness, not by viscosity. Okay. So the introduction on theory, if you wish, is done. And again, as usual, if you have any questions, or if you're watching the recording, you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, or send email to ResFrac support or to Garrett. I'll get it eventually. So now let's consider a more practical problem. So we have horizontal well, we have a stage, assume limited entry, so we have uniform distribution of flux between the fractures. So we have n fractures. I think I consider like 5 and 10. And let's see how does the fracture geometry changes with respect to fracture regime, or with respect to the physics which determines the fracture geometry. Okay, and as I said, this work has been done previously and is published in recently. It's early 2020, so it is available. You can read it and have all the results. So this is the map of parametric regimes, okay, as I just I described in the beginning. And I created the 7.7 different parameters, or sets of parameters, so that I wanted again to highlight the effect of viscosity here, the effect of toughness and leak-off, and what happens in between, okay? And so here I run a simulation with 10 fracs, closely spaced fractures, okay? And under the viscosity regime, right? I mean, the actual numbers are not important. I mean, again, in the paper you can find them, but it's not important. I mean, as soon as they line up such that we are in the viscosity regime, that's what matters. I mean, I try different numbers. As soon as you're in the blue zone, I mean, it's always the same answer. I mean, your final length is different, sure, but conceptually the answer is the same. But what you can see here is that there is some interaction between the fractures, and there are 10 of those, but they are pretty much radial, and there are no layers here, by the way. So they're pretty much all the same and radial. But if you now start increasing toughness or reduce viscosity, right? And so now if you land in the toughness dominated regime here close to the red zone, now you see what happens, right? So your solution becomes very unstable or very sensitive to perturbations. And so each fracture develops this petal-like shape. So essentially the fractures want to kind of have to minimize the overlap, right? So one fracture goes up, another one goes down or left or right, right? So there is no overlap between the fractures. And again, so in here you can clearly see that against different physics, because if you in the viscosity dominated regime, right? So what you want to have as uniform flow as possible. Sorry, all right, and so that's why you want to have more radial geometry, because it corresponds to more uniform flow from the wellbore to the fracture edges. When you're in a toughness dominated regime, your viscosity is not important, so your flow is not important. It's only toughness, right? And toughness, I mean, you can think about surface energy, right? So as soon as you create a fracture, there is an energy required to create the surface energy. And so you want to minimize the total surface energy, which is total surface area. And so these apparently minimize total surface area. Okay. So, and then if you do kind of other cases, right? I mean, you kind of see you have this transition from one to another, but basically it's again viscosity and toughness. This is kind of limiting cases. And so that's why I call this title of this talk, this pancakes and flowers, because these are pancakes to me, right? So they're all the same. I mean, look on the side, I mean, I admit, but still they're like pancakes. And here's like a flower, right? You have the petals, they don't overlap. And what I didn't say that these are planar fractures. It's homogeneous formation, planar fractures, no natural fractures, no layers, nothing. And you can still see this complexity, right? But you have to be closely spaced. Right, we can also investigate the effect of spacing, right? So before, I wanted to focus on the closely spaced fractures. Like it's kind of like a limiting case when the stage length essentially is smaller than the fracture diameter or the resultant fracture diameter. Now here we can see what happens as you bring these fractures closer together in the toughness regime, right? And so on the top you have results for 10 fractures, and the bottom you have results for 5 fractures. Okay. And this graph shows the total surface area of fractures divided by the collapsed area. So the collapsed area is basically, if you look on the side, okay, you look at the side, and then you kind of like add all these fractures all together into one single fracture, and then you take the outline of this and you compute the total area. That's the collapsed area. And so if this ratio is equal to the number of fractures, which is here like 10, means all fractures are identical, right? So you have, say, 10 identical fractures, you add them together, right? And the ratio between total area and collapse area is like 10. But if this ratio is close to 1, it means there is no overlap. It's another limiting case. And as you can see, as we tighten the spacing, and by the way, the fracture size was around 300 feet, right? The fracture radius. So this kind of, this characteristic, this kind of, this is the spacing at which the fracture size and fracture spacing are equal, roughly. Okay, and so again, as we go towards tighter spacing, we see that we have more and more interaction, and this total area essentially reduces. And in the viscosity dominated regime, it pretty much stays flat. I mean, it could be some numerics going on once you really close, but it's pretty much flat, right? So that's the message. And intermediate is somewhere in between. It's not as bad as toughness regime, but it's not as good as the viscosity regime. You still see how this very weird complexity, but you do have some fracture overlap still. Now, a couple of questions we want to consider as well is, are these results mesh dependent, right? And so here on the top there, I'm showing 3 simulation results with different mesh sizes, okay? 20, 10, and 5, right? And as you can see, that each individual fracture has different geometry, right? But the overall radius or diameter is preserved, right? It's the same. Okay. But I want to stress out that there is no toughness heterogeneity in these cases, right? So it's absolutely homogeneous. So it's actually the round of error determines where the fracture go. And so the solution that we have in ResFrac, I don't know if you are familiar, is that if you can add a little bit of toughness heterogeneity, and then the fractures are preserved, even though you change your, even if you run it the solution several times. Okay, kind of just killing this round of errors. And then the question is, what is the optimal viscosity, right? I mean, you can say, because what I said is, it's right, if you have toughness dominated regime, then you want to minimize the surface area, right? But then you see, if you have a lot of viscosity, if you're in a viscosity dominated regime, then fractures are very fat, very wide, and very short. So your area is also small, right? And so here I'm plotting the fracture surface area, the total versus viscosity. So on the left is toughness regime, on the right is viscosity regime. And so, as I said, I mean, even though your fractures are nice and identical in the viscosity regime, the total area is actually smaller. Okay, it is smaller because the fractures are shorter and wider. And so actually the best solution, again, at least from this analysis, I mean, it's very simplified, but just from this perspective, the best solution occurs when we're somewhere in the middle. In the intermediate regime, the fracture surface area is a little bit higher. And surface area, I mean, can be related to production, right? I mean, the more contact you have with the reservoir, the more potential you have for production. I mean, of course, it's important where the propellant goes and so on, but just in this simple case, right? So again, the intermediate regime gives the best surface area. Oops. All right, so let me summarize what I would like you to remember, or what's the main message, right? And first of all, again, I wanted to give introduction to fracture regimes, right? So the viscosity dominated is when the viscosity determines the fracture geometry and it's not the fracture toughness. And the toughness dominated regime is when it's the opposite, when the rock properties or toughness determine, or rock strengths, if you wish, determine the propagation of fractures and not the fluid that you pump. And depending on what physics dominates the fracture response, we may have very different, as you can see here, qualitative behavior of hydraulic fractures. And I argue we see them in projects, in everyday projects, but we're somewhere in the middle. So that's why then, I mean, we don't see these limits necessarily. Okay. And I also want to point out that this poor elastic stress and three-dimensional leak I ignored for this analysis, and limited entries enforced, right? So, in reality, again, you may have, I don't know, perforation erosion or some other things, non-uniform distribution of flux between fractures, so the result will be different. So this is just, a simple limit. Okay. And finally, then, we have this unstable fracture growth. And so this leads to problems with things like repeatability of the results. But the introduction of toughness heterogeneity actually helps to avoid this. So it's actually a very good solution. Let me say just a few words about this fracture strands, right? So many of you probably are familiar that there've been a core through experiments in which people course through stimulated rock volume and observed multiple fractures, many more than we thought before. Okay, so this is an example from the paper from ConocoPhillips, Rotterdam 2017. So within this 10 feet, right, we have many fractures. And there is a model that suggests that one way to model such a behavior is to represent these multiple fractures if they grow at the same time. You can represent them by scaling the viscosity as n squared, with n is number of strands, fracture toughness, and leak off. Okay, there are some references here. Well, I should warn you that there is an alternative study which suggests that these strands occur after the treatment, so during shut-in, right? So in this case, this model is not applicable, but we don't have strong evidence either for the first or for the second. This is my opinion, and so I mean, you basically you may choose whatever you think is more reasonable. Okay, but anyway, let's go back to the strands. Okay, so if you adopt this model, the question is, where do we move in the parametric space, and how do fracture geometries change if we increase this parameter n? And so this is again the parametric space, and if you have a dot with one strand, right here. So we are say somewhere in between viscosity and toughness regime. Then if we use more, many strands, say 10 in this example, right? So increase viscosity, toughness, and leak off. So obviously you increase leak off, so you have smaller, shorter fracs, and you reduce fracture efficiency, right? You reduce fracture volume. But you increase both viscosity and toughness. So the question is, do you move towards toughness or towards the viscosity? And if you do the math, you actually do move towards viscosity dominated regime. So what it means is that if you try to do a history matching, right, and then you play with this parameter with number of strands, then you can expect to move towards the viscosity regime, which means that your fractures will become more regular and will interfere between each other less. Okay. So that's the message here. And then the fiber optics, right? So the fiber optics data is also very popular nowadays. So, and we need to think about, again, so for those who don't know, so what is happening is that, as I say, we're simulating a fracture here in this well, and we put a fiber optic cable in offset well, and then as fracture propagates, so people record the stretch as a function of time, right? And so you can see here as fracture approaches here, you see these two kind of lobes, and then you have the first fracture arrival, and then second and third and fourth, and then it's the fracture closing. And you can read more in this paper by Peter Richter and others from Silixa. And this, there are visualization for one of the examples, right? So the fracture hit, this well and this one, and this one, and so on. But the fractures are not the same. That's my message, okay? And here the same, right? So not all the fractures arrive at the same time. But what does it tell us, right? If we were in the viscosity dominated regime, then all the fractures would arrive at about the same time, right? It means that we are not in the viscosity dominated regime. If we are in the toughness dominated regime, then again, this is like a three-dimensional picture. If you place one well here, you're probably just going to see one frac hit, maybe two, right? But we see many more. So it means that we are probably somewhere in between. Okay, so this is like indirect validation that we're somewhere in between. And as you can see here from these schematics, again, not all fractures are identical, but yet there are many frac hits, not just one. Okay, so and I think this is also important, thing to keep in mind when doing history matching. The arrival of not just the first arrival, but try to match more arrivals. So before we move on to what's new and exciting in ResFrac or going to be in ResFrac, let me just to summarize what I just covered. Again, it was something that I worked on over the last several years, and I wanted to be aware there are two sides of this hydraulic fraction modeling coin, right? If you wish, there are two groups of people which work on the same problem from different perspectives, more theoretical and more practical. And I think we need to encourage engagement between the two groups, because one group can learn from another and vice versa. But I wanted to give you in this talk the concept of fracture regimes, right? Because this regime determine the dominant physics which affects the fracture geometry. And I hope I convinced you that for the case of multiple fractures, it's important, because in the viscosity regime, you have nearly the same fractures, nearly identical. They don't like to interact, so viscosity kills it all. But if toughness dominates, on the other hand, then they really don't like each other, really want to avoid each other, okay? And again, just keep in mind all the assumptions which are assumed in the analysis, like uniform partition of flux, no layers, and so on. Okay, so.
And Egor, maybe just prior to us continuing, there's a couple questions that have come in that may be relevant to that past section. So I'll just monitor the chat channel and reiterate a couple of those. So the first one I see here that may be relevant to the last section is for the K and M storage simulated cases in slide 9.
Maybe 10. Okay.
Oh, maybe 10. Is the total fracture area equal for the two cases here, or is there going to be a difference in fracture area?
The fracture area is different. So what is the same, as far as I recall, is total volume pumped. Okay, but fracture area is different. And again, so there is a paper which I cited here, and again, it's going to be a list of all the papers at the very end. So all the parameters for every case is, they're all specified in this paper. And again, as far as I recall, the total volume is the same. And I think, another thing, what I wanted to enforce for these cases is the actual fracture radius being roughly the same. I think that's more accurate, right? The fracture radius is the same because I wanted to keep this ratio between the radius and the spacing the same. Okay, so I think probably the volumes are slightly different and the areas are slightly different. But if you go forward to this slide, right? So here, everything is the same, volume is the same, all the parameters are the same. I just changed the viscosity, okay? And so this shows the surface area as we transition from toughness regime here to intermediate to the viscosity regime, okay? So I think this is probably more relevant plot to this question, right? And so clearly in the viscosity regime, this total surface area is actually lower because the fractures are shorter and wider with the same volume.
Great.
I hope this answered this question.
The next is, I think, related as well. It says, for the case storage case, can you clarify if only one fracture is initiated from one point, or are different petals initiated from the same point?
Okay, so it's a very good question, right? So for this particular example, if I have 10 fractures, 10 clusters and one fracture initiated from each cluster, and I make sure that actually there are 10 fractures, and all of them being initiated because, I put a really extreme limited entry to make sure that all of them propagate. But the number of petals depends, right? Because here for this case, right, you see you have, this is fracture, right? It initiates here and then it grows into a single petal. While for this case, you initiate it here, and now you have these 4 petals, right? So it's kind of hard to tell a priori how many, it depends what you call a petal, right? But yeah, you may have this very different fracture geometries.
Great. And then maybe final question before moving on to the future is, are these different regimes, or are you familiar with work that correlates these various regimes to lithologies or geologic parameters?
So let me go back to, well, maybe just go to this one, right? So what I didn't tell you, I just wanted to, not to scare everybody with, the mass, but what are these values are, this parameter phi and tau, right? But these are the dimensionless numbers which depend on Young's modulus, Poisson ratio, toughness, viscosity, and leakage coefficient, injection rate, and injection time, okay? Again, there are no layers for this case, just radial fracture. It's all homogeneous. So once you specify these numbers, you actually get, so you can directly compute this parameter phi and tau, right? It's just basically some power, something like Young's to the power of 3 times toughness divided, power of 2 divided by rate to the power of 1/2 and something like this, okay? And so the geology in terms of Young's modulus, Poisson ratio, and toughness is there, is in these parameters. So if you go from hard to soft rock, then these numbers change, right? And also likewise, actually, if you go from lab experiment, if you want to try to do a lab experiment which simulates the field data, right? You need to make sure, because you change injection rate, you change injection time, you probably change the rock type. So you move quite a bit within parametric space. So you need to be careful when you kind of scaling down from field to the lab.
Fantastic, great. And of course, then things like Young's modulus could be correlated to clay content or
yes,
rock type.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, thank you, Garrett. So let me finish up the talk with something which I'm really excited about, and which I've been working on this for the last several months, and I think it's gonna be really nice feature in ResFrac, and it's coming very soon. But first of all, let me outline the problem, right? So first of all, the hydraulic fraction simulations are getting more and more demanding and require simulation of large number of stages, right? You saw example from Garrett at the beginning, right? So it could be several wells, several stages per well. And so say you want to simulate, tens to hundreds of fractures. Well, what do we do, right? We cannot really use really fine meshes because it's going to be very slow. So typically we use coarser mesh, or we want to use coarser meshes, but we don't want to sacrifice accuracy. Second thing is there is a need to account for high resolution properties, right? We know that for shells are really thinly layered, right? I mean, if you ever seen the picture of a core, maybe I should have put it there, then the layers can be really, really thin. And the question is, which ones are important, which ones are not? How do you know? Do you just homogenize? Do you upscale? Do you average the properties? Say you want to use coarse mesh, say 100-foot element, but you have 100 layers in this element. So how do you use all these properties? So I mean, how do you throw away or keep what is needed, right? So that's the problem, because this is very important for fracture height containment, right? And finally, there is a never-ending problem of mesh dependence, right? So we really want to use coarse mesh, but we have to make sure that it is accurate. Meaning, if you refine the mesh, the fracture geometry stays roughly the same. It's not going to be identical, but roughly the same. It's not going to jump 50% in length suddenly, right? And the solution, which is coming in very soon in ResFrac, is this continuous front tracking algorithm with multi-layer tip elements or multiple, right? And so this is a new algorithm which allows to evolve hydraulic fracture front continuously, as opposed to opening one element at a time, right? And because you evolve fracture front continuously, you know where your fracture front is located relative to your layers. So now this fracture front can feel all the layers which inside the element. That's why I call it multi-layer tip elements. So each element actually has multiple layers inside of it, and which affect the fracture geometry. And this is in contrast to what like 99.9% of simulators do, both academic and the industrial. They assume single value of property attached to an element, right? So it's a very, very, very different concept. So so far I have a couple of prototypes and some implementation in ResFrac. I'm going to show you how it looks like, but let me just outline how it looks for the simplest case possible. If you have a plane strain fracture, means if you have just fracture height. Think about it, you have a fixed length and you just grow fracture in height through certain lithology. And so I consider, again, very fundamental example where you have toughness, stress, and leak of 3 barriers, very thin, 10 meters each or 30 feet. And I run this simulation with 3 different meshes, 100 meters, 50 meters, 25 meters, or if you like feet, 300, 150, and 75 feet. And here I'm plotting the final widths just to show that it's about the same. And here I plot the evolution of fracture length versus time. So you start at the origin, and then you grow left and right, or up and down if you wish. And then you reach the first barrier, thin layer. Again, the element size is 100 meters, your layer is 10 meters, right? So it's 10 times smaller, but we stop exactly at the location of this layer, and then we cross it eventually, but then we get arrested by another layer right here at the top, and then we wait, and then we eventually cross, and then we cross the last layer right here. And as you can see, 3 different meshes give pretty identical results, very, very similar, not identical, but very, very similar. And even though you have very thin layers, much thinner than the element size. And this is the fracture volume. And again, essentially, you have no leak off until the minute 10. That's when you reach this barrier, which is high leak off barrier, right? So, and again, you lose the same amount of volume no matter what mesh you use, right? And I didn't put here the run times, but obviously, if you use large elements, I mean, you run much faster. And so that's how you can run, simulate many more fractures with having the same answer. So that was not convincing. So here's examples of actually did some randomly generated data in terms of layers for toughness, stress, and leak off. And the layer thickness is 20 meters. And again, I use the same 3 different element sizes, and I inject here at 0, the same parameters, just 3 meshes. And you can see how complex the fracture evolution is in height and length. You can see all these barriers and so on. And the volume loss, and it's all pretty identical. So it's remarkable. So you can, and again, 25 meters is still larger than the layer size. I mean, I can run it, with 5 meters, but why? I mean, if you already match, and you can, go towards more extreme cases. So if you have layer thickness of 2 meters, right? So again, you have 50 layers per element, right? So it's not just one value attached to an element; it's 50 different layers within each element. And again, you realize that this is a barrier just by looking at the results, but you cannot do this just by looking at this data, right? So that's what these numerical algorithms are for, right? And again, there's almost no mesh dependence. There is some, but it's fairly small. Well, you may wonder, well, it's all plane strain, it's not practical. Well, but it's the first step, right? Because then comes the radial fracture, then comes the ResFrac when you have multiple fractures. And so again, here's just some examples for the radial fracture. So this actually apologize, this, the scale is slightly different, but these are the same problem, same radial fracture, no layers, so inject in the middle, and just two different element sizes. So the red line shows the computed fracture front. The dashed line shows the analytical solution, the way it is supposed to be, the fracture radius. And these elements actually the actual open elements, okay? But based on these open elements, we still interpret the fracture front as being this red line. And again, the dashed line, have identical radius, about 150, 160 meters. And as you can see, we match regardless of our mesh, regardless of our resolution. And arguably, actually, the radial fracture is the hardest, one of the hardest to capture with square elements, right? Because of this curvature, right? If you have kind of rectangular fracture, it's easier to approximate with with square elements. Okay. Then let me just give you just a teaser of how can we achieve mesh independence. And here I have like extremely ridiculous case. I have very, very coarse mesh. So basically I have, it's the same problem here, all the 4 panels. I have 2 barriers on the top and the bottom, above and below the injection point. And here I show just the fracture front. I don't show the width just because I want to show all the elements here. And I just did different meshes. And as you can see, the fracture lengths, first of all, the fracture gets arrested in the middle of an element, right? So it feels this layer, the presence of the layer. So the fracture height is exactly identical between all the models. It's precise. So if I would just remove this, the actual elements, probably you would notice the resolution based on this corner, right? But still, the fracture height is precise. And the fracture length is very accurate as well. It's just over 300 meters here, or about 1,000 feet. Here and here, and here. Well, here actually, there's no 300-meter tick. It's like 400 next. But if if you do the math, 300 is about here in the middle of an element, so it's fairly close. So again, there's almost no mesh dependence, and even with this ridiculously coarse mesh, it's very, very coarse mesh. You still capture the fracture height and fracture length fairly accurate. And of course, if you just count the number of elements, I think if you go from 25 to 150, well, you do a factor of 6 in each direction, right? So it's about 36 times. In computation time goes as like 36 to the power of like 2 or 3, right? So it's really much, much, much faster if you simulate fracture this way rather than this way. Okay, and well, this ResFrac implementation is ongoing. So this is the first screenshot of the radial fracture in ResFrac with just just a few elements, and yep, and it's planned to be available towards the end of the year. Well, if things go sideways, maybe early next year. So that's the plan, and working hard to make it happen. And as I promised at the beginning, here's a list of references, everything I cited before. So, and yeah, I'm ready to answer all your questions.
Well, first and foremost, Egor, thank you so much. I think I speak for everyone when we say we very much enjoyed it. And I did have a couple questions that I had promised to get to from the beginning, but also feel free for the audience to raise your hand or speak up. But I'll go ahead and start us with one from the beginning. There was a question here about geothermal work, which I think could be quite an extensive conversation. And I know an area of expertise for Dr. Mark McClure on our team as well. But do you have any comments how maybe this would reflect or expand to granitic rock? And then we might be able to follow up with more specificity afterwards as well.
Okay, well, here's my answer, right? So So these are more like mathematical algorithms, right? I mean, they don't distinguish between, you know, granitic rocks or or shales, right? So what we need to have is rock properties and mechanical properties, such as, you know, elastic properties, Young's modulus, Poisson ratio, fracture toughness, and so on, right? And stress, and, you know, some other properties, right? So far, I mean, with geothermal, obviously, you need to have some thermal inputs as well, right? But I don't think that this particular thing, this fracture tracking algorithm, needs to be changed to account for these thermal effects. But I think we will look into it in the future. I'm pretty sure.
And it's worth saying that we do some work in geothermal, so it's something that we will remain cognizant of. Any questions from the Leonardo? You've raised your hand. Good to see you again. It's been a while.
Good to see you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, I have a question. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. My question is related to the first part. So I see that, you know, you have viscous dominated fracture that look very nice and symmetric, and maybe the toughness dominated, depending on, you know, where you are, maybe more like a petal type. Do you foresee any diagnostic that we can use to kind of benchmark that in the field?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and because, I mean, one thing, you can predict it, right? I mean, assuming that you know all the properties, but, you know, there's certain confidence in the properties. I mean, there's always some tolerance, right? And second thing, and I think that this fiber optics is the best way to diagnose it, because what I was showing before, like this, right? So if your fractures all arrive at about the same time, then it's a sign of the viscosity dominated regime. Okay. Again, provided that you don't have other things related to the wellbore, you know, like early screen out of some clusters, or, you know, if you have, you know, the same number of perforation holes per cluster and so on. I mean, it's very important, right? Because here I assume it's the same number of, basically the flux is distributed uniformly between the fractures. Okay, but if you have just one arrival from the stage, to me it would indicate that we are, you know, deep in the toughness dominated regime, because, you know, again, if you imagine this picture, now you drill, you know, a single well somewhere in 3D, you'll likely see only one or two arrivals out of all clusters. But based on this, at least, I think we are somewhere in between. It should be an intermediate regime.
Thank you.
Great question. Any others or thoughts?
For algorithm, you mentioned that in your element has several layers of the values, yeah? And it is distinct from the conventional finite method. Does it also distinct from the so-called enriched or extended finite elements, where the finite elements has some enriched set of the master functions? Or
Yes, yeah. Thanks for the question, Karat. So yes, it is different, because when you do enrichment in XFEM, right, or extended finite element, I mean, you add shape functions, right, to it. So basically, you allow to have a discontinuity within an element, right? But you don't actually add different properties within this element, right? So but you have different layers, different properties, but you know, it's different, right? But you have different properties, different layers, or you just allow to have, you know, some sort of discontinuity, like a crack, you know, within this element. You know, it is maybe close, but not the same. Thank you.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I don't see hands or chats. We'll give it just a minute here. So as a reminder, we do these every other week. We may be tapering those to once a month coming up soon. So last call for questions. So the question is, could you talk more on the fracture propagation velocity dependency on mesh size? And I think that's a great question, because one of the, we've been talking about fiber, and one of the things that we try to match in these fiber data sets is not only if a fracture crosses, but how quickly it crosses. Would these algorithms in terms of the partial fill and front propagation, front tracking impact that?
Right, so let's look at this plot, okay? Let's look at this plot. So here I'm plotting the length, or try to say the tip above the injection versus time, right? So that's like your depth, your vertical axis, right? And so this is position versus time. If you are curious about velocity, it's just the derivative of this plot, right? In some ways. And so while locally, if you really zoom in, you can see there are some oscillations, local oscillations. So you very locally, your velocity may be for some time steps different. But the overall trend, since the fracture size is preserved, okay, then the velocity is preserved for different measures. Right? I mean, if you think about and introduce a matrix of global velocity or some sort of average over some period of time, it is preserved because essentially it's a slope of this curve, right? And they are the same, right? Here and here and here. But very locally, if you have this little jump for one time step, you may have different velocity. Does this answer this question?
I think so.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thank you all once again for attending, and many thanks to Egor, I think one of our most popular office hours to date. Well, thank you all again. I'm going to conclude the meeting now and look forward to seeing you all on future office hours.